Gentlemen, my name is David Marsh. I'm the chairman of OMFIF, and it's a great pleasure for me today to introduce an OMFIF live session with Mário Centeno, who's the governor of the Central Bank of Portugal and also a former president of the Eurogroup and a former finance minister. So he's seen things on both sides of the central banking ministerial divide. Great pleasure to have you with us today here, Mário, when the European economy is still going through a bit of a rough patch. The aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia more than a year ago, general tightening of money markets all around the world, a minor banking crisis, you might say, not a full-scale one, but certainly some upheavals in the banking system on both sides of the Atlantic. They're all preoccupying factors. Now, just to start off with, perhaps you could just tell us how you see the general state of the European and particularly the Portuguese economy. We do seem to be slowing down as a result of all the unrest that we've had over the last year or so, plus the monetary tightening. So how is this playing out for you in the euro area, but also for the Portuguese economy? Mário, over to you.
Well, thank you, David. Good afternoon, and thank you for having me again. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Well, I totally agree with your introduction, with the list of issues that we carry right now. I will only go to disagree a little bit on the relative position in which we are in, because you'll see in a minute. I'm going to be brief with this. It is true. We are at the end, almost at the end of a recovery process from COVID crisis. We almost took our economies to a halt. We lent lots of support, both from the monetary and fiscal and regulatory authorities during this period. My evaluation of that is that we were quite successful at doing it. This was totally uncharted waters for us. And these waters, which were uncharted by then, now are a little bit troubled. So we are trying to bridge over quite turbulent waters. And I will start as you did, precisely with the war. We quite often forget that Europe is today with a war on our east front, which touches us all, and this is really limiting our capacity to respond to some of other challenges. We have to face all of them together, but really this is kind of a bit of a challenge for all of us decision makers today. Still, we keep revising GDP in the upside. We do this pretty much since the beginning of the recovery from COVID. This is very good because it has resisted the two energy shocks, the bottlenecks coming from the recovery from COVID, then this inflationary process that began, and I mean, of course, central banks had to respond to it. The ECB is doing it very actively, and we are very keen on our mandate. But nonetheless, this has a negative impact on the economy. So what we see today is the net effect of all these difficulties, the impact of all these difficulties in our economy. And if you take that perspective, you will say that we are doing pretty well, because we are, yes, growing below potential, but nevertheless we have been able to escape a recession so far. I hope we can continue that way. The truth in Portugal is pretty much similar to Europe. I mean, we have a very strong deceleration on growth from 2022 to 2023. But that has mainly to do with the final stages of the recovery from COVID. We are now again being led by our potential for growth, and the fact that we are, given the very challenging environment, growing that close to potential is really kind of a very impressive outcome for the economy. The main reason for this so far has been the resilience of the labor market. We have been performing amazingly well in the labor market, very low unemployment rates, record highs employment across Europe. Portugal is one of the major examples of that. We are right now forecasting employment to remain at these very, very high levels until the end of 2025, together with a growth rate for Portugal that is close to 2%. Actually, it's precisely 2%, our forecast for 24 and 25. Again, this reveals an economy that is able to respond to these challenges, even in the context of a tightening of monetary policy, totally unprecedented. We never.
If I may, Mario, we'll get on to.
Okay, sure.
We'll get on to the.
So that was maybe that was the reason. Just to finalize, that was the reason why I'm not really unhappy about the growth rate of the economy, because it really signals.
Well, as you say, it's something of a triumph, I would have thought, to avoid a recession. There may be a technical recession in one or two countries, but certainly not a full-scale recession. But the other side of the coin is, of course, inflation. And that's also partly because of this tightness of the labour market that you've just described very well in Portugal. And you see the same throughout the euro area. What's happening at the moment to wage rises? Because it seems as though in the euro area as a whole, the forecasts are that inflation will still be about 6% in 2023, i.e. 3 times the actual target. Are the labour unions now starting to say, we are fed up with the very large falls in real incomes that we had to put up with in 2022, and now it's time to have a more balance in terms of the wage settlements? You see now some strikes in France and in Germany for different reasons in both countries, but you do see some signs of unrest in the labour unions. What is the situation like in Portugal regarding wage claims?
Yes, it is true that all these processes, given the poly-crisis environment or sentiment in which we live in, create these sort of tensions. I think they come from different sources, as you told us. In France is different from what is going on in Germany and in Portugal. In Portugal, things are much more related with the public sector. But let me tell you my view. I try to be brief on the labor market in Europe and especially in Portugal. As I mentioned before, we were able to keep employment high in Europe during the COVID crisis because of public support and because of the behavior of firms that really held on to the level of employment, a little bit of labor hoarding, that nevertheless was supported by public money. But this meant that in Europe, there were two things going on. First, since we didn't destroy as much employment as in the US, in the recovery process, we were not taken to a massive wage negotiation, bargaining at the individual or collective level to restore employment. We essentially kept our employment and we kept our wages. So this means that in the first stage of this process, wage pressure in the labor market was much more subdued in Europe compared with the US, because there was no big deal to revise wages in Europe as they did in the US, in which firms had to rehire workers or hire new workers with new wages, and there are big pressure coming from the labor market. Labor force participation increased in the European Union. Portugal is one of the champions on that. Still this year, in the first few months of the year, we have record high participation rate and participation rate increase. This is not going on a broad basis in the US, nor even in the UK. So the European perspective is very different from there. But then there is the other side of the coin, which is what I call some sort of pent-up rotation in Europe. We all know that churning and rotation in the labor market is what brings productivity up. And in Europe, we have some sort of pent-up rotation that is occurring increasingly at this moment. Take the Portuguese data again, that I know the best. You have in the last quarter of 2022 a recovery of the new hires in the economy going back to 2019 levels. This means that this sort of rotation is picking up. It brings about wage increases, but those wage increases are most of the time, and that's what we know from labor economics, associated with productivity gains. In Portugal, the average wage of people getting new jobs increased in 2022 close to 16%, 1/6. On the contrary, or otherwise, people that remain in the same jobs had a wage increase that was not above 5% on average. This means that there's a lot going on in our labor markets, and we must look at it in a very positive way, because this is the way Europe has to increase productivity after.
It's a sort of Schumpeterian revolution going on then in some ways, isn't it? If people
it is
more frequently, as creativity.
You are absolutely right, and we should try not to kill this Schumpeterian revolution, because we really need it. We really need it. We need after a very good response in COVID, we now need a very good response after COVID, because we need the economy to move ahead.
Yes. So, but could I simply ask you a question now about the links between monetary policy and expectations? I don't want to spend too much time on this, but a lot of people say that the ECB started relatively late in tightening. I think that might be a fair statement without attaching too much blame to you. Does that mean if you do start relatively late in tightening, you have to actually add more tightening pressure within a short space of time, say 9 months, than might otherwise be the case? Because you've got to somehow act on expectations. But could this tightening policy over a relatively short space of time, you've now had 6 changes in interest rates in the last 9 months, could that lead to some unpleasant side effects, including on the financial markets, which wouldn't have been the case had you been more gradual?
Well, time will tell if we actually reacted late or not, because we were in a process of trying to cope with COVID. The largest fraction of inflation in the first months of the inflationary period in Europe was imported from the shock in energy, imported from the US, because wage pressure, inflation pressures in the US became demand-led very, very soon in the process. For example, private consumption in the US was exactly at pre-COVID levels in the second quarter of 2021. In Europe, we had to wait until the end of 2022 to get there. So we actually were faced with quite strong external shocks to the inflationary process in Europe. And we started reacting to it in December 2021, when we established the end of our net buying process for assets in the PEP and APP. And then we started hiking after setting up very important instruments to guarantee that there is no fragmentation in the euro area.
TPI, which I remember asking.
It's the TPI, exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Notice, David, that this is the first time ever in the 21st century that a crisis, being it a mild or a strong crisis, does not deliver an existential crisis to the euro. And this is very, very important for our social fabric, for our economy.
That is absolutely true. And I want to ask you a little bit in a moment about the spreads. But you don't think that the fact that you've had to pile on the brakes relatively quickly since July with the raising of the interest rates, you don't think that might have some expectational effects, which are really positive for the labour market, but they may be negative for financial markets, because you are subjecting some banks to some stresses because of the unusually large rise in interest rates over a relatively short space of time, which of course does have this depressive effect on valuations, as we've seen in banks on both sides of the Atlantic.
We do know that monetary policy takes time to be effective. There's a time lag. We know that from Milton Friedman's work a long time ago. So we need to be patient. Moreover, in Europe, for example, take households. With the exception of Portugal, Spain, and Finland, the vast majority of Europeans have fixed rate contracts, credit contracts. So it will take time for this to take a hit in the economy, at least in the household side, and we need to accommodate for that. I honestly don't see, and I haven't seen it yet during all this process, the anchoring of inflation expectations in the long term. The most nervous inflation expectations are from consumers, and we got very good numbers early this year for consumers' expectation on inflation 3 years ahead. They actually came down quite significantly at the beginning of the year. I think the credibility and the determination of the ECB to fight inflation is people cannot take that lightly, because we really take it very seriously.
And you don't find, therefore, that the expectation that there'll be 6% inflation in this year in the euro area, you don't find that feeding through into unjustifiably large wage claims at the moment in Portugal? Yes,
I didn't touch upon that question before. We don't see signs of second round effects on wages setting in the euro area as of today. We, of course, have higher wage increases than before. I mean, but that's absolutely an inevitability given the inflation we have. But we don't have wages going after inflation. In Portugal, average wage increase is, slightly above 5%. But we have that after a very long period of very low wage increases. So this catching up that we see today, still with negative real wage increases, is compatible with what we would expect for monetary policy purposes. Let me tell you another indicator that is very important to all this process. Despite this loss in real wages and despite the very high inflation, we don't have a reduction in real household disposable income in Europe or in Portugal either. We have very strong numbers on that. Can we make that compatible with a reduction on inflation? For me, that requires a little bit of coordination that we need to work very hard.
Are you saying people are drawing down on their savings? Is that the reason why disposable income?
That's also part of the story, because we started this hiking process with very large financial buffers, both on the side of firms and on the side of households. I'm not telling, and I don't believe that they will last forever, so we must be cautious about it. But indeed, I totally agree with you that we are observing a behavior of de-saving, both from firms and households, to react to this. Because
if I may just go back to this issue about the financial markets, and several people from the audience have asked this question, Mario, we are seeing now some signs of a slowdown in bank lending because interest rates have gone up. As you say, it may not have had much impact on households yet, but it does seem to be having some impact on the banks and their borrowers. Are you concerned about this fall off in the rate of bank lending? And is this a factor why in your next meetings you're likely to be rather cautious? Indeed, one of the audience members says, has the balance of people at your meetings changed in the last few weeks towards more caution about the possibility of, quotes, over tightening, end quotes?
Well, let me be honest with you. Of course, I was always on the side of the cautious people. So I tried and I try when I look at these issues always to bring as much. I think we have to minimize the biggest loss.
Are there more people like you, Mary? Are there more people in your camp at the moment than there were, say, 3 months ago?
Well, I think I will not count people like that, but things are evolving. I mean, financial stability and the functioning of the monetary policy transmission mechanism is at the core of our mandate. We made it very clear in July 2021. In July 2021, we were still very much worried about having low inflation and low interest rates for long. And we established principles of action that already in that circumstances took financial stability and monetary policy transmission mechanism issues to the core of our actions. So now that we see some uncertainty building around these dimensions, it's all natural that we take that very high in our agenda. But that's not the only thing. We really need to believe that the transmission mechanisms are working. They are working on top of an economic situation that at the beginning was characterized by the buffers that we already mentioned. And we cannot fool ourselves by saying, well, nothing is happening, so this is not working. No, the tightening is there. We know that it will be there for quite a bit of time. Tightening does not stop when the interest rate stops hiking, because as long as we have an interest rate that is above the neutral rate, we will be tightening, and that's very important. And we will continue in that vein as long as inflation rate.
I'm sure a member of the audience will ask in a moment, what is the terminal rate? But I'm not going to ask you that. But one audience member is just saying about the Deutsche Bank. There was a flurry of speculation against the Deutsche Bank on Friday. The Chancellor Scholz did say that seems to be overdone. That seems to have calmed down a bit today. And a lot of banks make money when the interest rate rises, although this inverted yield curve that we have at the moment is a bit of a problem. Are you worried at all about any question of banking stability in the euro area as a whole? Could you tell us?
Well, I think monitoring is the buzzword. It's of the essence. Of course, I will feel relieved if markets behave as they are behaving today. That will compound in some reassuring in the future that we can count on this on less uncertainty coming from that dimension. But the truth is that the ECB is closely monitoring the current financial market tensions. We know but just by going through the numbers that the banking sector in Europe, in the euro area, is resilient. We have strong capital and liquidity positions. I mean, we have a whole range of instruments, if needed, that we can take in, and whatever it takes action to fulfill the responsibilities of the ECB.
You don't see anything systemic at the moment here.
We don't see anything systemic right now. We have a crisis management framework that also requires countries to step in if needed. We from the ECB side are ready to contribute to calm down any or to counter maybe any threats to monetary policy transmission.
Right.
It's a joint work.
Yes, no, I can see that. It's the two sides of the coin. Another question from the audience just come in though about financial stability. I know Mrs. Lagarde said last week that there's no trade-off between financial stability and monetary stability, but on the other hand, the two things do tend to work together. As you just said, you look at both elements. Is there a feeling or even a concern that you might actually bring to an end the anti-inflation battle through monetary policy because of some undefined problems in the banking sector at some time in the future? Is that the kind of thing that haunts you, that you worry about in your spare moments of the day or the night?
Well, when we hear from the markets and from institutional investors and every other stakeholder of the ECB, the first concern that they've been raising for already many months is the risk of overshooting in our policy. And I take all the trade-offs that you mentioned as economists in a general equilibrium terms. I mean, there is no contradiction today between monetary and fiscal policy. There is no contradiction between price stability and financial stability, because we know we cannot have price stability without financial stability. The ECB went already through to quite difficult periods in the last decade or so because of not getting right the balance between the two. In general equilibrium, that doesn't exist. We need to take all complementarities, all spillovers from one side to the other. One thing that worries me, and I've been also talking about that, and I think we need to take it very seriously, and many central banks are already taking that very seriously, is the spillovers that come from the most synchronized global process of monetary tightening across the globe. We, as central banks, have been acting all together in the same direction. These as spillovers. My one sentence is, under these conditions, we can do more with less. The spillovers, in my opinion, mean that we can do more with less.
Well,
and
that's a disguised way of saying that you might therefore stop earlier if you've all been doing things together. It has a cumulative effect, doesn't it? Where you might say the sum is greater than the parts.
Indeed, take that to the fiscal domain and remind yourself of what was the result of a strongly coordinated and in the same direction austerity period back in 10 years ago. And what we saw then was that all elasticities, all multipliers in our models were way below what we saw in reality, because of all countries acting in the same direction, regardless of their fiscal position. So I think we cannot commit the same mistake. Very
strong point, Mario. A question here from Mr. Pinnell of Market News International, and I'll just put the question quite verbatim. Has the recent financial turmoil meant that the ECB peak rate is now going to be lower than it might otherwise have been before the SVB and the Credit Suisse upsets? In other words, do you think that ECB rate hikes could now be over for this cycle?
Well, if it's over or not, we have to see with the data coming in the next few days and then until May, because I am very keen on deciding based on data and meeting by meeting. I don't have to decide tomorrow, so I can really wait until early May to see what the numbers tells us. But it's almost a tautology to say that with these problems arriving at the euro, affecting the euro area, because it affects the whole world, coming from the US and coming from Switzerland, they have to have an impact on our decisions. If I don't take this seriously, I will not be dealing with all the information I have available to me. That doesn't mean that I see a spillover being or an externality being materialized today in the euro area. We need to continue, as I mentioned, monitoring all current financial market tensions to understand where they can take us. But I really want us to take all information available on board. I was really surprised. Not surprised. I was not really very keen on taking away our long-standing strategy of deciding meeting by meeting. We cannot give the impression to the markets that we are deciding without bringing.
Well, I agree. I thought it was rather confusing that your president did say at the end of last year, well, we're probably going to have 2 rate hikes of 50 basis points each. And then she also said at the same time, but we're not giving forward guidance. That seemed to me to be a bit of a contradiction. But we are now beyond that period, clearly.
Yes, indeed. Thankfully.
But I mean, now that we are beyond, it does seem more likely that we're going to have 1/4 of a point increases rather than 1/2 a point. That seems to me any rational person looking at Britain, looking at Europe from another planet, might actually say this looks most likely there's going to be 25 basis points at a time rather than 50 basis points.
Well, again, it will depend on the data, but we need to be very clear that we want to preserve the stability that Europe was able to instill in the world this time around. Again, David, you know, we did not go through the stimulus packages that the US government put in place. If you add the deficits of the US of 2021 and 22, and you do the same thing to the euro area, you'll get a 16 percentage points of GDP difference. Europe was really contained in the way it reacted to the COVID crisis, much more focused, much more targeted than the US. And that implied that from the fiscal side, we did not have the demand pressures that we can easily identify in the US.
That's an excellent point. In fact, there's quite a lot of questions coming in now, Mario, about fiscal policy, which we'll do in a moment.
Good.
Just before we do that, another question from the audience says, would it make life easier if you simply said you're going to make decisions not every 6 weeks, but say every 3 months, in line with the forecasts? That would be a very good data-dependent way of deciding your decisions. In other words, you would not make a decision in May, you would wait for the staff forecast, which will be then in June. Would that be a good way of solidifying this more cautious approach that you've got now?
The forecast is a very serious data information that we have, and we have to work with it. So if you go back, you will see that the major changes in our policy actually occur around new forecast moments. So that's where we really take everything more into context and take decisions that most of the time last for actually at least the pace and the way we move forward. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't discuss in every 6 weeks, indeed, the new data that we receive. I mean, inflation, financial data, of course, we take it. But the forecast is a very important moment. And if you do this, you will realize that between December and March, we brought down the staff projection, brought down the profile of inflation down all the way until the end of 2025. In the present forecast, we reach our target of 2% at the end of the second quarter of 2025. This is almost 6 months before what was expected in December. The European Commission is even more optimistic, and it has a forecast that brings inflation to 2% at the end of 2024, 6 months earlier. I mean, this is the trend right now. We need to make sure, of course, and to continue evaluating how this forecast behaves. But this is the line that we see right now.
Well, it seems to me that you are saying de facto that there are differences between these meetings, but so that's an important point. I think based on what we said on this data-dependent issue on the fiscal policy, we've had the president of the Bundesbank, Joachim Nagel, saying recently in very firm terms that the European Union's got to get real about these fiscal targets. The Stability and Growth Pact has been suspended. It's got to come back again now by the end of the year. That seems to be the general consensus. And Mr. Nagel is calling for targets which are more stringent, less discretionary, and more binding. What do you say about that as a former president of the Eurogroup? He's also suggesting that if these targets are not brought in and not made more serious, then the ECB might have to do more tightening, monetary tightening, than would otherwise be the case if the other side of the party is not contributing in the way that the central bankers would like them to. So how do you react to that message?
Well, this is a very important debate in Europe. I will be very disappointed if we restrict it only to going back to the previous framework, which is nevertheless something that I really want to occur. I think we need to go back to the rules that govern us before COVID, and those rules. And you're right, I was the president of the Eurogroup, and I was really happy, believe me, to reach the end of 2029 with 14 out of the 19 member states at the medium-term objectives for fiscal policy, to have a risk reduction that was very strong, that actually allowed us to approve in the European Council of December 2019 the first, I'm going to call it embryo, of the central fiscal capacity for Europe. This is the way to go. We need to keep reducing risks. We need to trust each other. We need to reduce the sentences on moral hazard, because that is the only way we can bring the more than 80% of Europeans that firmly believe in the euro to stay put and to stay together with us.
So when you say a greater fiscal capacity, are you talking about some sort of regime for own resources, or are you talking about a further build-up of the next generation EU fund? What do you mean by a central fiscal capacity?
We approved in December 2019 the budgetary instrument for competitiveness and convergence. This was an instrument, a very detailed instrument that was available since then, and that actually contributed a lot to the design of Next Generation EU. We need to evaluate Next Generation EU. We need to see what is the true impact of that in Europe, and I believe that it will be a very positive one. And if we evaluate it positively, I don't see any problem politically for us to replicate it into the future. But first, we need to implement it, to be very effective on that, and to continue. But that doesn't go, that's not the end of the story. So in Helsinki in 2019, in September 2019, we started discussing the revision of the Stability and Growth Pact. This is a very long discussion, as always in Europe. I think we need to go a little bit further. We need to discuss all issues related with completing the banking union.
Let's not go down that path, because that is actually a very, very long path. But are you agreeing that you want the Stability and Growth Pact to be revised in a way which is less discretionary? Because at the moment, it does give a lot of nations some individual leeway, and some people seem to think that's a bad thing. It needs to be a standardized formula, not something that you do case by case.
My opinion is the same as when I was finance minister. We need to make it more transparent, more accountable. You need all numbers around the Stability and Growth Pact to be replicable by anyone, because you cannot transmit the stance of policy if only the European Commission knows how to get to those numbers. That won't work. People will not understand what is going on. We need to use numbers that are not revised in the future, because you may give directions for fiscal policy that then prove to be wrong or need to be revised. So in a way, we need to simplify it, to make it really understandable by all. And that's in my view the only way you can
and more binding as well. Would you say that transparency and the binding nature, you've got to understand it's not to be simple and clear, but also something that you will dodge out of. It has to be something you will stick to.
But believe me, I worked on potential output when I was at the beginning of my career. I worked with John Stock at Harvard, and I know exactly what he thinks about these methods. If you base fiscal policy on variables that are latent and that are revised very often, you will not get anywhere.
Okay,
believe me.
Look, we've got a lot of questions still coming in, and just 15 minutes to go. So let's go back to another element of your monetary policy, which is quantitative tightening. You've announced, as you said, an end to the net purchases. You've started now not to reinvest the full sum of the APP bonds maturing every month. Some people would like you to go further, and there's some thought that you might, from the end of June, no longer reinvest any of the APP bonds. At the present time, if you carried on the present rate of reduction of your balance sheet, you would reduce the 5 trillion euros worth of bonds on your portfolio to zero after about 27 years. So clearly, some people think you should do a bit more quick than that. Do you think that there will be an end to the reinvestment of all the APP bonds from the third quarter?
Well, one point. I don't think anyone has a view that zero is an optimal point to stop. We need to also evaluate on our way what is the optimal size of the balance sheet, because my intuition is that zero is not the number. So
we'll take that as read, but the point is
very good.
The present rate of reduction is quite slow. That's the point.
Well, we need to do it. Again, let me be very clear about it. Up to now, the decision is indeed to decline 15 billion euros per month. This is so until the end of June, as you mentioned, and we will reassess that. When we reassess the pace, it is important to ensure that it remains consistent with monetary policy stance. We don't want this to interfere in the monetary policy stance, because our main focus right now is to control inflation and to bring it down to 2%. We need to preserve market functioning and maintaining control over short-term money market conditions in this context, because otherwise everything falls from our reach, and we don't want it. So this is my conclusion. We need to stay vigilant, and continuously monitor
I mean, I'm
market.
sure you do that very well, and
Yeah.
full marks for monitoring and vigilance. But do you think that the balance of people on the governing council who are arguing for a slightly more speedy rate of quantitative tightening, do you think those people are becoming more or less important as members of the governing council in the light of the problems we've had in financial stability around the world in the last couple of weeks?
I'm gonna answer you coming from the other side. Maybe and this is a very honest answer, and I'm not revealing anything in particular, but I don't see any discussion in the governing council that is not even close to put at risk or to jeopardize financial stability in Europe. More even so these days. The last time we discussed this, we were very far from SVBs and First Republic and Credit Suisse issues. We will bring all this on board. And what I think it's fair to say right now is that we will continue reducing the balance sheet. The biggest contribution.
It seems very fair drawing from what you've said, Mario, that you're going to take a safety first element there, because we are in uncharted waters with quantitative tightening. It's not been done to a great extent. It's been done to some extent by the Fed. The Bank of England is doing it now. But in a cautious way. Could I just ask you another question linked to the balance sheet, though? This is something I believe you have discussed, although maybe not the full-scale governing council meeting. That is the idea that you do need to take some measures, it seems, to drain this 4 trillion euros of excess liquidity that you have in the euro area. This is pretty rare, really. You're starting to raise interest rates at a time of this very high level of liquidity. Could you not do something here which would also help to restore some balance to the profits of the commercial banks and the losses of the central banks? That would be by increasing reserve requirements, possibly quite aggressively on banks, and also introducing an element of non-remuneration on the bank deposits. I believe you have talked about this in maybe in smaller groups. I know you haven't made any decision on this, Mario, but it seems to me quite a logical idea that you should at least be discussing this to introduce an element of non-remuneration, so that you're not giving away 3% every time a bank puts some of this enormous amount of liquidity with you. Well, what do you say about that element, just from a purely theoretical point of view? Because I know you've not made any decisions yet.
Yes, indeed, we didn't, and actually there is, as you can imagine, a lot of analysis going on. Central banks are known for having the best research and economic departments in the world. So we will continue looking at these issues.
You have lots of them as well, don't you? You have lots of economists.
No, yeah, there is no excuse. There is no excuse for us. I can tell you that because I know it the hard way, what it is to be in the government side and the time we have and the resources we have to take decisions. No comparison at all. But the truth, I mean, again, we have been at all stages of this very long process that started maybe already with the financial crisis in 2008 to adapt our instruments, our policies, the tiering system that we implemented in the context of the TLTROs, trying to balance the cost for the banking sector of our measures, trying to make them effective, because of course it's a monetary policy decision that it's of biggest interest for us. But we know that we operate in a world that has a much rougher landscape than probably what we would like to.
Well, that's right. So, you don't think you're being too generous to the banks, though, because the banks are getting 3% now, often making relatively good profits, despite these isolated cases. Most banks are doing quite well out of these higher interest rates, but paying their staff big bonuses and so on. And then the poor old central banks are making losses because there's a mismatch now between the interest rate structure on the two sides of your balance sheet. So surely one should have a bit of sympathy for the central banks and say that some of these deposits should be non-remunerated.
Well, that's a fair concept. I can tell you, for example, that to guarantee a full effect of monetary policy our monetary policy decisions, we change the conditions under which the LTROs operate in November. We want this to be quite balanced. We are focused on bringing inflation down to 2%. We cannot risk not achieving that goal because of any side effect of all these policies, and we want everybody to contribute to that. We know that what tightening means for the economy. We know what tightening means for the banks. We don't want to leave any part of this with some sort of soft budget constraint that will benefit some at the cost of others. It's a very complex issue. I'm not answering your question, of course, David. Sorry for that.
No, it's all right. I didn't expect a very direct answer, but you're answering it in a way. But just ask about the question of central bank losses. From an economic point of view, I don't think a central bank can actually go bankrupt. So from that point of view, we're all happy. But from a public perception point of view, the fact that inevitably central banks around the euro area will be making some losses in coming years, is this a factor of concern because of the influence that this might have if you see headlines in the daily press saying Banco de Portugal has making a loss because of this imbalance in the interest rate structure? Is this a factor of concern, and what can you do about it through greater transparency and greater clarification with journalists, with the financial markets, and with the public at large?
Well, again, conceptually, this is a very simple exercise, right? You have the assets, you have the liabilities of central banks. You have remuneration on one side of the balance sheet. You have to pay also remuneration on the other side of the balance sheet. We were all, in terms of results, very lucky during the period of quantitative easing and very low interest rates because the mismatch worked the other way around. And we are making very generous margins, interest rate margins.
And you pay dividends to the government.
And paying dividends to the government.
Put some money into reserves as well, didn't you?
Yeah, but not only that, David. All central banks, and of course we need to see now if it was enough or not. It depends on for how long this all will go. But all central banks made also provisions, very generous provisions, that will help them traveling through these more difficult times now in terms of results. But you said it all. I mean, central banks are not to give profit. Also, the interpretation of more difficult times in terms of results or even equity for central banks, it's not comparable to a regular firm. My view, and this is the case of Bank of Portugal for sure, is that in the foreseeable future, we do have enough reserves and provisions to face this transition while it lasts. It's true, we distributed a lot of dividends to the state in the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years, but we also accumulated quite significant reserves.
I believe I'm right in saying also, Mario, that for the euro area as a whole, there may indeed be some central banks who are making real losses in the next 2 or 3 years. Particularly the ones actually with a higher credit-worthy bonds, because the bonds are yielding less. But I believe that
even negative.
Even negative, that's right. But I believe over a 10-year period, if you look at a 10-year period, and I would advise central banks to do this, then you will be returning to profits, let's say after about year 5 or 6. So it might make sense in anything that you publish, either you as a national central bank or the euro area as a whole, to do a 10-year view. That's what I would do. Obviously, give OMFIF the figures first before you publish them, Mario. But I definitely think that whatever you do, you should publish a 10-year view rather than just say a 3 or 4 year view. I don't know what you think about that recommendation.
Well, I mean, it's at this stage, given the uncertainty that we face, it really is not easy to come up with figures that can be published for such a long period of time. But this is not something that I can promise you, but I can certainly work that out. And no, because of the following, my major wish right now, if I may have such a thing,
you allow one wish every hour. Yes.
Yeah, that's true. No, it's much more at the same time simple to say and to define, but at the same time also more difficult to materialize. No, it's as soon as inflation is on a sustained and clear path down, we will be much more clear about monetary policy in the future. And from that moment on, it will be much less speculative, and central banks cannot speculate about numbers of their balance sheets, of course, and that moment will allow us to communicate much more openly on that, because right now
we should be at that period fairly soon. But you've just got about 4 minutes left, and I've got two questions from the audience. One is about debt. Actually, you mentioned debt before. The spreads in the Portuguese case have been relatively stable. You're compared with Bunds, I think you're just about 90 basis points, something like that. It's not too bad. You haven't experienced too much unrest over the last period of months while tightening's been going on. The questioner says, is that surprising to you that there has not been any marked spread widening? And then the other question linked to this is that the inflation of 6% this year is actually quite helpful for the countries which are relatively highly indebted. Are you either wittingly or unwittingly profiting from high inflation to reduce your debt burden in terms of the debt per GDP?
Well, let me answer the last part, and then I'll go to the first, still trying to leave time for the second question.
Yeah.
I mean, this is too high an inflation for anyone to be pleased with this number in terms of reducing debt. Of course, it helps. The more than 14 percentage points reduction in public debt over GDP in Portugal in last year was because of inflation, of nominal issues, but also because the deficit of the government deficit was 0.4%. It's much lower than Germany. We now beat Germany for a big difference, and in a very challenging moment in time, I think the Portuguese stability now is really something that Europe should put an eye on. So it's very impressive. But I think the reason why we are not having a rift over Europe this time is because of the way we prepare before COVID, the risk reduction that I just mentioned to you before, the way we responded to COVID, the Next Generation EU, especially the financing conditions of Next Generation EU. Finally, we issued tons of European debt. The European Commission now has something that resembles pretty much a treasury. And this is AAA debt that is being used by all European countries right now. So I think this is very, very important. And then
certainly you see in the case of Italy, I'm sure in your case as well, that money is coming in just at the right time, isn't it? At a time when the ECB
indeed. There's a very famous sentence in our communique of the Eurogroup in April 8th, 2020. In which we call all ministers and all governments to be creative and innovative in the way to face the crisis. And that's exactly what we delivered. Then the ECB also has been doing its part, the TPI, the cautiousness that we have been putting into our policy terms. that also helps in containing
But also, you did say earlier in the broadcast that if the NGEU does well, and of course we're not at the end yet, it could be replicated in the future. I think that's an important statement. Again, we don't know what's going to happen. Very final question, a point that Mr. Nagel was making quite a bit when he was over in the UK last week, talking about what he called the team spirit on the governing council. Now it's got one more member, of course, it's even bigger now at 26 people. We do know in the past under Mario Draghi, there was quite a lot of bitterness actually from time to time with the so-called hawks and the so-called doves. People said to me some time ago, we are all pragmatists now. How would you actually describe the degree of esprit de corps on the council during this time when you've all been busy raising rates? How much team spirit is there, and how much divisiveness is still left over from the Draghi era?
Well, I am in a very peculiar position because I presided over the Eurogroup, and I can assure you that it's much more difficult to deal with 27 finance ministers than with a governing council of 26 in Frankfurt. That doesn't mean that we don't discuss. That doesn't mean that we don't disagree. That doesn't mean that we don't debate. We do. We do all that, and at the end we reach a consensus. It's a collegiate decision. We all understand how difficult it is to take decisions right now. What I really would like to pledge, if I may, is for us to be better at communicating, because we need to keep the pace of our communication. We cannot go back and forth on the strategy. That's what I really wanted us
okay, well, that's a good point. And I think in a small way, we've contributed to this in this 1 hour we've had today. Although it's a small audience of only about 100 people. So thank you very much indeed, Mary. I do hope we can come to Portugal as well. We have been in the past, Carlos Costa was there. We had some wonderful occasions where we could talk in person about all these things, including the Portuguese growth and debt profile, including things which we've not had time to talk about today, like say education reforms, supply side economics, and as well. And there's lots of things we've left out today in podcast, but we look forward to coming and perhaps doing that in person before too long. We will certainly.
Thank you.
I think that would be a very good idea.
You'll be most welcome. As usually, it's very difficult to keep the pace with your questions, but I hope I can have given here a contribution to the debate.
Well,
thank you so much.
We've got through lots of questions. We must have had about 25 different questions, including from the audience. So well done. Thank you very much indeed for surviving 25 questions an hour, rapid pace, but you've been very good in giving us information and also giving us a sense of the qualitative as well as the quantitative place that the euro area is at. So Mário Centeno, thank you very much indeed for this hour.
Thank you, David.
And we look forward to the next stage of talking to you, and good luck with all your endeavours in Lisbon.